Hello everyone, my name is Pepsilk, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about Resident Evil Village's reception and how it's been received amongst the community and critics alike. Over the last few weeks, I've been playing Resident Evil Village and also monitoring the reviews that critics and users have been saying, and I realized that Resident Evil Village is pretty mixed, to say the least. On one hand, you've got Steam reviewers critiquing and talking about how great the game is, how it's a mix of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 4 combined in one package alongside the gauntlets, the lords, the origins of the Umbrella Corp, and just having an overall really good story and pacing. Well, on the other hand, the critics are talking pretty badly on Resident Evil Village in terms of dumbing down the horror to compensate for action, having Capcom having a focus on focus groups, and also just the bosses appearing very unappealing at first and just very boring. And I wanted to talk about some articles that I read today and also and try to dissect it and see how the game has really been developed, as well as just talk about what users have been saying. Before I get into that though, I want to talk about my own quick opinion on Resident Evil Village. I found Resident Evil Village to be a great game from start to finish. I didn't run into any issues. The PC port ran. I played the game on PC, and the PC version ran perfectly fine for me, despite watching Digital Foundry's video. Shout out to Digital Foundry for showing how bad the PC port actually is. And I hope that Capcom do consider making some changes to it. I mean, no FOV slider in 2021? Really, Capcom? Really? I had to download a mod just to get an FOV slider so that I could scale it to how I want it, because as much as I like the standard FOV, and it makes sense for a game like Village, because in Resident Evil 7 they kept with the same FOV, I don't really like how you can't change your FOV, period. And just being able to change it makes it good, especially for those people that suffer from motion sickness. I also enjoyed the action and pacing of the game, taking from going away from a survival horror to an action survival horror approach, similar to what I was seeing in Resident Evil 4, which I was so happy to just see the game be like essentially a remaster of Resident Evil 4. It was awesome to have a different variety of weapons, a merchant that's as mysterious and sus as the OG merchant from RE4 as well. And just the way that the game was marketed and just played out, I thought it was really well done. I didn't have any issues with the bosses. The story played out just fine. And yeah, it was just overall a solid game. So the first article I'm going to be going over is an IGN article titled "How Resident Evil Village is a direct sequel to Resident Evil 7 but heavily inspired by Resident Evil 4." An IGN first article that was published on the 1st of May 2021, the week before Resident Evil Village came out. And this is an interview with the director of the game, Morimasa Sato. Sorry if I butchered that, I feel bad. And he was talking about the development of Village and how he wanted this experience to be different to Resident Evil 7. Just as a heads up, I'm going to be leaving all the articles I talk about in the description below, and if there's any article you should read, I would highly recommend you read the IGN article, as it's the most detailed and really explains Capcom's decision making behind Resident Evil Village and how it's been marketed and developed. So I've already read each of these articles as well, so you don't have to do it. And I like to talk about key points that I think are important to talk about when talking about Resident Evil Village. So the first line is, quote, "While Resident Evil 7 satisfied fans of the genre, some players found it too scary to even play. For Village, the team went for an experience that is still scary but in a way that more players can enjoy. To achieve this goal, they came up with two key phrases that would shape Village's identity: a theme park of horror and ultimate survival horror." So what do these terminologies mean? Well, in terms of a theme park of horror, Capcom have designed Resident Evil Village to be a game where you go through different stages and areas around the village in order to get different items, and basically each area is a new experience. So you have Lady D's castle, you have Heisenberg's factory, Morial's swamp or reservoir, and Beneviento's dollhouse, all providing different experiences. So, as an example, Lady D's castle is meant to be reminiscent of Resident Evil 7, where you're backtracking, you're going through very tight interiors, while also trying to kill Lady D's daughters and also evading Lady D herself. Followed by Heisenberg's Factory, which is also reminiscent of Resident Evil 7. More backtracking, more collecting items, puzzle solving, and just trying to get the pieces together in order to get to Heisenberg. Then you've got Morial's Reservoir, which takes you through a swamp filled with lots of water, as you can tell, and just being able to navigate from one place to the other while trying to get parts in order to activate and remove the water source so that Morial gets weakened and put into a state where you're forced to fight him. Followed by the dollhouse, which is probably my favorite area, the dollhouse, where you're stripped of your weapons and you're forced to solve a puzzle, which is where Beneviento is trying to play tricks and play your brain by solving a puzzle that has a doll or like a mannequin of Ethan's wife, and also by playing your mind further by having an undead fetus, which is probably one of the scariest things I've ever seen in a horror game. And I don't know who developed that, but whoever did, I gotta give him props. It was amazing. That was probably the best sequence of the game too. That dollhouse section alone. And ultimate survival horror would mean bringing a bunch of different genres and things together. So with Resident Evil 4, which is a perfect example to compare to Resident Evil Village, that was a mix of over-the-top action and survival horror, where Leon would be using a bunch of different weapons, items, while also navigating through areas and having to solve puzzles and deal with some jump scares at the same time. Whereas with Resident Evil Village, it's kind of the same thing, but there's more variety compared to Biohazard. There's more enemies to kill. They're more frantic and all over the place when you're trying to fight them. There's enemy variety, and it's just a combination of action and survival horror. But Capcom also had to consider the balance of the game, where there has to be at least a good amount of action and a good amount of horror. Because if there's more than the other, which some critics did feel that there was more action than the actual horror, then yes, it would definitely make give the game. It would definitely make the player's perspective, I guess, different, because the game won't be as perfect for them as it is for another person, right? Recalling back to that terminology of theme park of horror, Resident Evil Village developer Tsuyoshi Kanda said, quote, "The village that you will be exploring is much more than just a collection of streets and houses. The player will be discovering 4 different areas surrounding the village, with one of 4 lords, the game's main villains, awaiting the player in each area. From a gothic castle with a giant countess to a reservoir area ruled by a merman-like creature, the variety of characters and locations shape what Capcom calls a theme park of horror." So basically what I said in regards to the 4 lords and going to all these different areas, but each area having its own unique experience to try and differentiate and give players different experiences of horror, not just the same horror you would see like in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, where it was very linear, tight, intense, and just scary, with the main focus being the Baker family. But with Village, it's more or less about different villains and characters to try and, I guess, hit towards these focus groups that they talk about, which I'll mention later on. Sato then proceeded to say that, while aiming for a broader experience, I didn't want to lower the game's peak of fear. Keeping the peak intact is essential, but if the game is tense throughout, it can become too much for certain players. That's why we needed a change in pace and included elements that afford the player a feeling of safety. With more freedom of exploration than in previous entries, the player can, to an extent, pace his or her own experience. I want to share my thoughts on what Sato has said here, because I think this is also a minor spoiler if you haven't finished the game. But then again, I'm just going to say it, it's not actually that big of a spoiler, thinking about it. But basically, as you progress through each of the areas, you get this winged key that you have to find parts for and like kind of attach parts to the key in order to unlock the other doors. And you're forced to go through the game in a certain order. And I feel like if Capcom had given us the option to be able to go a different approach and pick other lords to go for instead of just everybody going for the same person. Like, for example, you go Lady D and then you go straight to the dollhouse afterwards. What if I could go to Lady D first You're forced to Lady D, so you have to get her first. But then you're able to, like, say, get Heisenberg next, or go for Morial after. I think having that freedom of choice, as they say, even with the freedom of exploration and going back and backtracking to other places, you'll still be doing that in order to get items, and once you get certain things in the game that you can use to open up, like a well wheel, sorry, that you can use to open up wells and lift it up to get items. I feel like having that option was a missed opportunity for Capcom, and if they had done that, the game would be a lot more praised, and I don't think people would be so limited on talking about, on criticizing the game and saying that you're limited to freedom, even though there is a lot more freedom because you're forced to go through the lords in the same order. And I forgot to mention from that first quote, where the hell did they get the quota from where players found Resident Evil 7 too scary to play? I get as a marketing standpoint that they want Village to be a game where everybody can play, and that's totally fine. If you think about it in a marketing aspect and them making money out of it, it's fair. But I think Capcom should really take the time to just don't bother with focus groups. Like, just create the game that you want to create. If you were able to create Resident Evil 7 Biohazard perfectly without any kind of player reception, I guess the player reception that they took would be from Resident Evil 6, because Resident Evil 6 was just an absolute joke and basically steered away from the entire Resident Evil franchise, so it was ridiculous. But they kind of went solo and just went straight for it without any kind of reception for making Biohazard. So why bother making the game to get it to you know, have a focus on everybody in particular, even people that aren't really fans of horror games, when they could really just develop it to be like an Amnesia Dark Descent game or something like that. I feel that if they were just able to develop it for their own and not develop it for the sake of money and for people, I reckon the game would have turned out 100% better. But they really wanted Village, when they got unveiled last year, they wanted Village to be a game that was going to be very reminiscent of Resident Evil 4. So it's fair for them to, I guess, create it this way. But I think if they were just sticking to the true survival horror roots of 7 Biohazard, I think the game would have been a lot better. The next article that I want to cover, well, it's more of a review article, something like that. It's from Kotaku, called Resident Evil Village as told by Steam reviews. And I just want to talk about all the funny and, I guess, interesting ones that I've seen on here, which kind of gives you an idea of the reception of Resident Evil Village. The first one is from Bayou Boy, and I think it's a really solid review of the game. An excellent game, but don't go in expecting the horror experience to be more on par with that of RE7. Resident Evil Village at its core is Capcom's attempt to recapture the magic of Resident Evil 4, and to a varying degree they pull it off. It is more of a greatest hits of horror compilation than an effort to dial in a specific feel. This review was written after the first completion of the story. It seems short of 10 hours, but that's the thing. Much like Capcom had done with RE2 and RE3's remakes, they have added a cavalcade of bonus content to spice up your concurrent playthroughs, not to mention the fact that Mercenaries mode has made a return. It's a surprising move, and I'm curious to see how it shapes up. Completionists will have a field day with this one. I completely agree with what this guy has said for the fact that it is indeed a greatest hits of horror compilation, having staging and having all of these different areas, and each area having a different feel. Totally agree with this guy. The next one is from Burning Mine. If I were writing this after playing 2 hours, it would be a glowing thumbs up. But this game has some essential pacing issues. First half is almost all puzzles / horror with maybe 30 minutes combined of combat. Second half is almost all combat and cutscenes. And the second half is far less memorable and well designed than the first half. But more than that, it really fails to engage as a survival horror game. You're never managing resources, making choices about whether to expend ammo on an enemy you'll know you'll need to go past again, etc, etc. Honestly, I didn't have an issue with the pacing of Village at all. I think the pacing of Village was totally fine. What I would say that I'll go into detail later in the next article is Lady D's area. And Lady D's area is heavily... Lady D herself, actually, is heavily underutilized, and I don't like it. And the next article will hopefully give some more light. And I kind of want to shed my thoughts going into why Lady D's area in particular was underutilized compared to the rest of the game. As for managing resources and making choices, I don't want to really call them out here, but did you play on the lowest difficulty, buddy? Because if you played on hardcore, there are definitely choices where you have to manage your resources. Like, the enemies take a lot more hits on hardcore. And I ran into choices or situations where I was pretty much like running out of ammo to an extent, and I had to kind of craft and look for supplies on the spot. More crafty on the spot, especially during the boss fights, even though the boss fights do give you a lot of ammo, ammunition, and supplies. But yes, there are definitely parts where I did have to manage resources. Next one is from Dover. Tall, thick, vampire, dummy, mummy, milkers. Really? I mean, I don't blame him. From Kiyohime. I hope I said that right. I've been repeating the cutscene of the Dimitrescu family catching me and Lady D sucking the blood out of me for several hours now. Is this normal? Yes. Yes, it is perfectly normal to see your hand get sucked over and over for hours and hours. I'm not going to say the next names, I have no clue what that says, but one hand simulator with RE engine. This is pure facts. Ethan just keeps getting his hands chopped off. It's not fair. It's not fair. Not to mention he just gets his hand chopped off, puts some alcohol on it, and it's all of a sudden attaches it and it's working again. Yeah.
Okay.
Last one to end this segment is from Counterlife. A solid entry, but often feels too much on rails or scripted. The first 3 mini-bosses are basically all the same fight, with a tiny gimmick being different each time. The plot/writing is really nothing to write home about. It largely feels uninspired and is filled with typical horror genre cliches. Even one plot twist is just a huge cop-out, and past that point the writing becomes even worse. However, from a gameplay perspective, the game is very much entertaining. During some of the more open-ended sections of the game, the exploration and survival horror aspects really shine, even though it has to be said that they are nothing groundbreaking. The environments really radiate with atmosphere when you're just exploring around. Furthermore, the game's length is much more appropriate this time around compared to RE7. I honestly agree with this. The plot isn't anything crazy for me either, but just watching all the cutscenes and stuff happen and unfold in game is actually pretty lit. Like, I actually enjoyed most of the stuff that happened in RE Village. So, yes, I agree with this. I absolutely agree with this review. The next article I want to talk about is Resident Evil Village's most iconic characters are wasted. An article from CBR.com. Where they talk about how Lady D and the daughters are heavily underutilized, which I honestly agree with what they're saying here. Quote, while Resident Evil Village has been getting great reviews from critics, many have pointed out that Lady Dimitrescu is only featured in a small portion of the game, and all signs point to Capcom not expecting her to become as popular as she did. The internet's excitement around the character's unique design certainly built towards the disappointment around her underuse in the story of Village. Castle Dimitrescu is the first location that Ethan Winters will visit and serves as the game's first act, so to speak. However, players are only there for a few hours before toppling Lady Dimitrescu and moving on to the next area. Fans were also disappointed by the end of the Castle Dimitrescu segment, with Lady D's battle ending in her being definitively killed. This means that despite all the excitement behind the character's design, it's unlikely that she'll return in a future Resident Evil title. So before Resident Evil Village came out, if you've seen all the trailers, you'll know that Lady D and the daughters were and the castle as well were the face of Resident Evil Village. These characters had so much potential, and it sparked a lot of interest for probably new fans of the series too, not just because of her thickness or big boobies, but just her character. She's a very interesting person. She has she's got a bloodlust. She's tall. She's probably the tallest character I've ever seen in a freaking video game, and she's just a really interesting person that I feel like if we were able to stay around with her for longer throughout the first segment of the game, I reckon we would have gotten some extra information about what Lady Dimitrescu really is. She's more or less she's kind of treated as a villain per se in this game, but you don't really get much details about who she really is aside from just being a very tall character, which you run away from as well, like Mr. X. But the way that her AI is programmed on this game, she's very lackluster compared to Mr. X and RE2, where Mr. X is right in front of you and you're kind of like, it kind of worked. His character kind of worked with the linearity of that game as well, where you're kind of forced to run certain directions and not just go left to right and dodge and weave. Maybe that's why people pointed out her AI being kind of lackluster, because the areas are a lot more open, so you're given more chances to be able to run away. She wasn't really that hard to escape from either. But just her marketing, Capcom put so much faith in Lady D being the face of this game that you only get to see her for a few hours, and then before you know it, she's dead, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't bring her back. The only way to bring her back is if Capcom decides to revive her in another in the next game, but only time will tell. Just really a shame that Lady D just had to suffer and just lose her purpose like that. The last article I want to talk about is called Resident Evil Village is a depressing example of focus group game design. An article by Game Central. And I can't with this article. I disagree with everything that this guy is saying. It's ridiculous. Everything he is saying is ridiculous. I pull up the article because there's a lot of things that I want to talk about in this article in particular. So the first thing I want to mention is this. Ever since Resident Evil 4, there has been an uncomfortable internal battle at Capcom between wanting to continue the series in the manner in which it became famous as the father of survival horror and trying to make it more mainstream, i.e. more profitable. Even though Resident Evil has always done alright for itself, adult-rated horror games are never going to be massive sellers. Not compared to something like Call of Duty or even Monster Hunter. Where the hell did you get this mindset of Resident Evil Village wanting to be a massive seller like Call of Duty or Monster Hunter? Those games don't even come close to... Resident Evil Village doesn't come close to getting to those levels of Call of Duty and Monster Hunter. Call of Duty is a franchise that's existed for over 20 years. And you're telling me that you're trying to compare Resident Evil Village to Call of Duty. Monster Hunter has also been a franchise, a Capcom franchise that's been around for years. And Monster Hunter coming out on PC is probably one of the best things that's ever happened to Capcom because there's never been a Monster Hunter game on PC before. So, of course that was going to be a big deal. Next part. This right here. Capcom had the sales to prove that Resident Evil 7 was successful and well-liked, so why immediately try to undo that with the sequel? Resident Evil fans might not always agree, but the last thing they want is some PG-13 style horror game that's not going to please anyone. Village falls between two stools, and it's not surprising to see its launch was underwhelming, selling less than all the other recent games except Resident Evil 3. Don't get me started on that one. It's clearly going to do well, but it's no record breaker and didn't even outsell Super Mario 3D World, which is a single format game that's not even brand new but a remaster. We're comparing Resident Evil Village to Super Mario 3D World. I don't get it. And to shut him down on an underwhelming launch, Resident Evil 8 was #1 top seller on Steam, had the highest peak concurrent player ever in Resident Evil. It's also the highest peak for a single player survival horror game on Steam, second highest peak ever for a Capcom game, next to Monster Hunter World, and he tried to compare this with Monster Hunter. Third highest count ever in the horror genre on Steam. Peaked at #5 for top games by player count, sold over 3 million copies in 4 days. And I know it may not be as much as Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 3 as you put it, but still, it sold out really, really fast because people were so hyped for this game. Over 650,000 viewers on Twitch and 95% overwhelmingly positive Steam-based reviews. Like, seriously, really? You have the audacity to say that this game was underwhelming at launch. I don't know. The rest of it is just blabbering on about how it was made for focus groups, which is probably the only thing I can honestly agree with this article is that Capcom really did make, as I said before, Resident Evil Village for different focus groups, so everyone can get a taste of the experience. Even if people do decide to leave out on the first area, I mean, if they do decide to stick around, the game isn't as bad. Like, if I had to recommend Resident Evil Village as a first-time horror player for someone, then yes, I would honestly recommend Village of all games. Like, Village is probably the best game to get into for horror games. And if you want to get into something scarier, you got your Amnesia, you got your Penumbras, your Somas, your Outlasts. Like, those are just a few great horror games that I would think I can think of that are really, really scary and don't involve shooting people on the spot. And that's it for all the articles. If I had to pick a side on whether I'd be with critics or users, I'm obviously going to go with users. I'm definitely going to go with myself. Like, as much as I do take critics' reviews, I take reviews with a pinch of salt, because even if a reviewer does give it like a 50 or 60, you may end up liking the game yourself, and you don't know that. You know, I always look at user reviews, because user reviews are a better way of interpreting whether or not the game is actually good. than relying on critics themselves, because critics, I feel like, just kind of they kind of talk. They either you don't know whether they're being serious about it, because there are critics out there that I'm pretty sure do get paid to give the game a solid review, and I know I'm just making that as an assumption. I don't know whether that's actually true or not. That's the way I see it, though. But I don't really believe in critics that compared to user reviews. User reviews are a better way of interpreting whether or not a game is better. But that being said, at the end of the day, you gotta always judge a game by your own account. Never try to judge it from users or critics. And take that from someone who judges games from user reviews. I'm trying my best not to kind of look at user reviews as a way of interpreting whether or not I enjoy a game. But at the same time, it's like you need to try. It's always good to try and consider the game in your own words, because if you do, you never know. You could enjoy a game that's got mixed reviews on Steam, and you may just like it for a few reasons that other people will probably disagree with. But that's the way I see it. Anyway. And that's it for the video. I just wanted to shed my light on Resident Evil Village's reception and how I thought of it as a whole. And that being said, I loved Resident Evil Village. And if anyone wants to ask if you want to buy it, yes, 100% get it. Get it on full price. I highly recommend it. Support the devs and keep Capcom going with Village, because Village is a really, really good game. Even though people may not like it from different perspectives and all that, I think I think a lot of people will still enjoy Village, just as a game, as a theme park of horror, as the developers have put it. If you enjoyed the video, like and comment is appreciated. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.